Now let's start with that card look. In case it's not clear what I mean that look which we also used earlier for the first demo project, where we simply have a nice white background and a slight drop shadow. And I'd like to have that for every meetup item. Now we can solve this by adding a couple of CSS classes in the meetup item module CSS file, and then changing the look of our list item. That would work. But this card look is so common that we maybe also want to use it in other components of this application. And we will actually use it in other components later. That's why I want to create a separate reusable component which should act as a wrapper around other components and just give those components some styling, which we then reuse. And for this, in the components folder, I'll add a new subfolder which I just want to name UI for user interface. The name is up to you, of course. In there, I want to store some general user interface components which don't belong to a specific feature, but instead are used in different places of the app. And here I'll add a card.js file, and attached you find a card module CSS file, which you can simply add next to this card.js file. And in the card.js file, we'll now create a component as we did it before, simple functional component, and export it, of course. And we'll also import the styling, import classes from /card.module.css. And then in the component function, return a simple div where we set the class name to classes.card. Now, the special thing about this component is that this should now be the first custom component which we can wrap around JSX content. Because the goal is to use this card component such that on a meetup item, inside of this list item, we can use card, and for this you need to add the import. So import card from going up one level, diving into UI, card. And we can wrap card around that JSX content so that we can use the card component like this. That's the goal. But at the moment, if you save all files, the result is that you don't see anything. And the reason is that at the moment, this card component simply swallows everything we wrap and throws it away, you could say. Because this card component just renders a div, and it doesn't know what it should do with any wrapped content. Now, it's such a common case, though, that you build components that should wrap itself around more JSX content. So you could say that you want to inject JSX content into this component. That React, of course, has a solution for this case. And this solution, again, is related to props. We learned that we can pass props by adding attributes to an element, and that does work. But you can also add a special prop by passing content between the opening and closing tags. And that content is then exposed under that special prop inside of that wrapping component. So here we accept the props parameter again. And then between the div tags, I want to output props.children. Props.children is a special prop. The children prop is a special prop which every component receives by default. And children always holds the content which is passed between the opening and closing component tags. So this JSX content, that is the value stored in that children prop in this case, when we use card in this component like this. And now I'm just outputting the value stored in children between these div tags. And with that, if we reload, we now have this slight card look and we see a drop shadow here. Since we take up too much width, we don't see it perfectly, but we can see it a bit. And if we inspect this in the DevTools, we see that every meetup item here has this div with the card class. The name was transformed because of that CSS modules feature, but it has that div with a card class wrapped around these other divs, image, content, and actions, inside of the list item. So that wrapping works, and that is another very important technique when it comes to composing user interfaces with React components. And that's why we also cover it here. And we can now use this technique as well for setting up a general layout for this application. Because I'd like to have more white space around the content here. And for this, I'll go to the layout folder and add a layout component in there. Attached, you also find a layout module CSS file, which you can add next to this JavaScript file. And then here in layout.js, we can create a layout component function and export it as a default. And import classes here from /layout.module.css. And then in here, return our layout. And that could be a div with our main navigation, let's say. So from app.js, I'll cut main navigation and remove the import there. And instead in the layout component, I'll add that here. And therefore, of course, also add an import of main navigation from that main navigation JavaScript file, which is next to the layout file. And below that, we could use the regular main HTML element and then use the layout component such that we wrap it around the actual JSX code that should be rendered. So we could say that in app.js, we want to wrap the content selected and rendered by the router with our layout. So here in app.js, we can import layout from, going up, diving into the components folder, layout. And instead of having this useless wrapping div, we could use our own layout component for wrapping here. And now this content here, the actual route content, the page component that is being loaded, should be rendered inside of this main block. And we can again achieve this with props children. We can again accept props here and then output props.children here inside of the main element. And that will then just forward that content, which is between our layout tags, so this content here, into that main element. Now here we should also add a class name of classes.main for styling. And with that, if we save this, now we're utilizing this nice layout component for wrapping all our content. It's technically not required. We could have added the styling in another way too, but it is another nice practice of this children concept, and it removes some extra code from our app component and makes sure that this component can focus on one main thing, rendering the routing configuration. Because your components typically should be focused on one thing. And now we got a leaner app component, and we're again using props children to create this layout component here.